Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Bass Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random.
Exceptional Radio.
Hey, good afternoon. It is, what day is it? This is the 4th of December. We're in the home stretch. The final 26 days, 27 days left of the year until the big party that happens every year.
Right.
So, in the last week, I have noticed that there seems to be like an exodus of users from Twitter platform globally. In the last month, they've lost about a million of their daily users, which is significant because they've only got like 300 or 400 million monthly users, and these are people that log in, like unique logins every month. And Meta, which we know their Verse platform, which has got like 85 people in it and is quite pathetic. Their primary social network platform that we all know and have used is seeing its daily and monthly logins increase. Now, in America, of course, because we're all embroiled in what's going to happen with the tweet deck, there are huge volumes of new sign-ons, but I'm pretty sure that a significant number of these are people who want to participate in the newfound freedom of speech that's been afforded by Lord Musk.
Oh man, Americans.
And of course, like immediately after he says everyone can say whatever they want, everyone except Kanye. And I don't really want to go any further into Kanye because that's just like a ball of mental illness that I don't really, oh, man, it's just so unfortunate. But anyways, what I want to know is, what does Zuckerberg have on Elon that could get him to do some dumb shit and ruin Twitter and drive people back to Facebook?
I don't think that has anything to do with.
No, I don't either. It's just a bad joke.
I think Elon's just dumb. We're finally getting confirmation, and it's like
It's finally happening.
the way that he's not talking about Tesla's recalls or SpaceX and like whether NASA needs to be getting the contracts that SpaceX is getting, and like there's a lot of things about his previous ventures that are, it's not that they're falling apart, it's that he can't keep pumping their price based on some sort of new announcement. Like the AI day / when they tried to show Optimus, it didn't bump their stock value the way they anticipated and the way it would have in the past.
Well, I think that the consumer at large is becoming a little bit more dubious of his claims and his presentations. They finally started delivering electric semis to Pepsi. So we'll see really quick how these actually work, and I think it'll be reflected in the price of Pepsi products.
Well, and I guess like when you're saying that like Meta's users increase, I don't know if I know it's not going to be 1-to-1 from people leaving Twitter going to
not at all
Facebook, and part of it is like the exodus from Twitter isn't in any concerted location. So this is one of the reasons. Well, I mean, in that nobody's going to the same place. So you have people going to Hive, you have people going to Mastodon, you have people going to Facebook, you have people going to other places that I don't know. Like some of them are going to Parler or whatever.
Oh man, the list,
Truth Social,
the list of social networks that are available today.
It's insane. It's insane.
It's beyond reasonable. It's like we went from having 4 gyms available globally, and now there are like 60 gyms. And they all have similar equipment, and they all have essentially the same kind of landscape.
Yeah. So what I see happening actually is the fracturing of the social media era, in that there's too many platforms competing for attention, and there's not enough consistent movement in one direction. And in that perfect storm, it's like the youth aren't really interested in social media nearly as much. Like TikTok isn't dying, but it's like whenever TikTok starts to not be cool, I'm not necessarily expecting kids to pick up social media as another, like, I don't know how many more generations social media as a trend can perpetuate, especially in the notion of like the idea that influencer is a job and people will call themselves influencers. That shit is not gonna last for much longer. If any, like, I can't imagine influencer being a job for more than like 3 more years realistically, in that it doesn't translate into sales, and people are finally realizing that like these Mr. Beasts and the PewDiePies or whatever, they have a bunch of people watching their shit, but advertising on their platform does not translate into capturing that audience in the form of turning it into a sales funnel.
So,
and there's finally enough evidence to show that it's like, yeah, you can advertise on those channels all day, but unless people are actually interested in your shit, it doesn't matter if you advertise there.
So one of the things that I noticed was actually kind of interesting is Facebook is the king. You know, they've got like billions of users every day. And or not billions, hundreds of millions of users every day. And they've got like 2 billion users monthly that sign in. And that's absolutely the definition of the social networking platform. They made a movie about it called The Social Network. This is not a plug because I have not seen that movie. I've only listened to the soundtrack. But YouTube, which I've always considered to be a content delivery, content creation, sharing platform, is rated as the second largest social network platform. And I thought, Google Plus failed. Every iteration of Google's meeting space, well, I guess Google Meet, is that what it is? I think that's actually working, but Hangouts didn't work. Their Google Chat, Gmail Chat didn't work, or GChat didn't really seem to work. Whatever they're doing now, it's just kind of playing catch up. But somehow YouTube is just gigantic. And I never conceived it as a social network platform because all of the comments are just, half the comments are, well, I guess it is. It's just like a forum once you get into the comments. It's just a forum based around videos as the lead of the thread. Well, anyways, YouTube itself generates an incredible amount of revenue with user-generated content. And some of the content doesn't generate any revenue at all. The ones that I've seen, actually, I got to frame this a little differently. I've seen that there are a variety of different types of YouTube content. There are expository documentaries and essentially what amounts to journalism. And then there are the veiled review commercials, which is like the influencer, where they build up a lifestyle and they broadcast the lifestyle and they talk about all the stuff that they use. Like, oh, this is the greatest thing. It's changed everything. It's revolutionized the way that I do something. And these are long form commercials. And that's not something that I've noticed on TikTok. I mean, I see people like showing off their stuff, but it's not quite the same hardcore infomercial, essentially. Influencers create infomercials more than they create actual content, in my experience. And that's, I mean, I remember when I was a kid staying up really late because I couldn't sleep and I'd watch TV really quiet, and the only thing to watch was Ron Ronco spray hair onto his bald spot or talk about the food dehydrator that he could make turkey jerky with, or fish jerky, and how it was great, and make brand new organic fruit snacks, things like that. A mandolin, a vegetable mandolin made out of plastic that had a safety handle so you wouldn't slice your fingers off. But now you can watch an infomercial about anything, about vacuum cleaner air filters, or alternative replacement light bulbs for a fixture that have the right kind of socket, but you want it to look different. It's all out there, and it's all veiled as like, oh, I'm reviewing this thing, but most of these reviews spend a lot of time focusing on one product. And then now what I've noticed is, because a lot of these reviewers want to be impartial, they like to announce, "Oh, this is not given to me by this group. I paid for this product. This is a legitimate review." And then about halfway through the review, they stop to talk about their Patreon. You can help support something or other with Patreon. And I looked into Patreon at one point, and it seems like I don't know. It set off enough red flags for me that I just didn't proceed. But maybe that's just me being.
What do you mean?
I don't know. It was a while ago. Maybe I need to reread how they operate. It just seemed like creating something to sell, essentially, and then funneling people from one platform to another. It's like a siphon.
I mean, it's like the exact opposite of selling things, in that when you like support someone on Patreon, you're like giving them money so they can make things.
Yeah.
with no expectation of getting anything in return but them being able to make things, which is not, it's not like Kickstarter, GoFundMe, where it's like, oh, if you give somebody money, then it's like you're getting something in return, where it's like Patreon is like explicitly like not expecting anything in return almost every time.
Really?
Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's where I'm like, I don't know what like, I think it's when you see YouTubers talking about their Patreon that it doesn't make sense because other people use it besides YouTubers, not just YouTubers.
Yeah, I think that's got to be it, because the only people that I see
Like
talking
comic
about
book artists and shit use it.
See, that's cool, and I was unaware of that, because the only time I ever hear any kind of commercial for Patreon, it's within the framework of an influencer telling me to buy some other product too, while also going and giving money to their Patreon. It just seems like it's I'm just dubious of that kind of behavior in a what amounts to an infomercial. It's like, wait, I'm already trying. They're trying to sell me this. Now they're trying to sell me this other thing. What?
And this gets back to what I mean about that influencer period being close to ending, in that it's too obvious when somebody's trying to sell you something. So these channels have to like build up their audience, not selling them anything. And then one day, then it's like a switch happens, and either there's like paid product placement, or it's like the Patreon page is where you get the cooler content if you want to actually be, you know, behind the scenes or whatever. And it's like, it's a bait and switch from the beginning that's planned. Whereas in other cases, when people are just right out the gate, like, you know, on Patreon, and that's where you encounter them, it's not, there's no concealing what's happening, and that's also why there's no deception involved. But I think that's where like YouTubers have progressively become more and more deceptive with presenting content that's an infomercial as if it's actually entertainment, when it's really, as you're saying, it's like they're telling themselves it's edutainment when really it's just an infomercial.
Yeah. I mean, anyone listening out there, you can't go to our Patreon because we don't have one. But if you'd like to support what we do, I mean, I'm sure there's a way. You know, you're right. It's the end of it all, of the influencer, and it's happening in front of us because they are outright saying we need more money to do what we're doing. And what we're doing doesn't actually pay for the lifestyle that we project on YouTube. I don't think it was meant for people. I don't think that Patreon was meant for the YouTube influencer. I think, as you indicated or elucidated, it's for actual content creators, like musicians and comic book artists and writers. For people that are doing things that are, you know, better than just creating commercials. I mean, Patreon doesn't care. They get their slice anyways. But I think that's the same thing with YouTube. I don't think that it was actually created. I don't think its inception was to, hey guys, let's create a conduit so we can create commercials so that marketing departments have lower overhead. I don't think that's what it was at all.
I mean, it's just really the last stage in the evolution of the salesman in the middle that is not actually
necessary.
Not necessary, but there because they have a perceived greater capacity to understand beneficial consumption to be someone the audience should listen to guide their consumption. And that's where I mean, like, previously in the last 20 years, it's been really easy to hold an individual up, like Steve Jobs, for example, as someone who people will then trust to be like anything Steve Jobs does concerning technology, he's the smartest guy on earth. And I'm just going to trust him because he's proven that he's smarter than me, quote unquote. So I'm just going to leave this decision making. If he makes an iPhone, or if he like guides the making of an iPhone, I'm going to trust that he's got my best interests over myself. And that's that capacity to offload the knowledge about something as if that person would then act in your benefit more than their own to exploit your lack of knowledge is something that people wanted to believe because capitalism like use propaganda to make it seem like that. And you can't really blame people for falling for it.
He did the best infomercials. His
infomercials
for sure. Were
but
out of this
it
world.
Goes beyond him. They're inundated with it in like movies and television and just the normal narratives of like the robber baron that's going to accumulate all this wealth and then use it for the betterment of society. The notion that that person ever really manifests is like, it's believable because people are constantly inundated with stories about that person saving the day. So you can't even really blame anyone for falling for it.
Man, I remember when I had all Apple computer stuff. It's because I was still trying to rationalize that I needed to use it because the software that I was using that I wanted to use was more stable, and the hardware that I used was Mac only, and part of that was because it had higher grade components and it was more stable. And here I am, like, let's see, that was in 2010, 11. Okay, that was like, a decade ago, 10, 12 years ago.
Mac had the lock on Pro Tools for a while.
Yeah, they did. And they also had the lock on a certain grade of hardware. Like all of my Motu stuff, it functions now perfectly in a Windows environment. And I want to emphasize the word perfectly because I've been using Motu hardware for decades now. There was a time when it was only functioning properly on a Macintosh. And you could kind of get it to work on Windows, but it was dodgy at best. So you might as well stay in the Mac ecosystem because then you can get full performance guaranteed out of your hardware. Well, it only took them a few years to figure out, oh, wait, guys, we've got computer science. We've got computer scientists with, like, incredible amounts of experience. Hey, guys, can you write some Windows drivers that work? Yeah, sure. Why didn't you ask us to do that last year? And now all their products work cross-platform, and some of their products have not necessarily full Linux support, but you can get the hardware to work in its entirety, minus some of the more advanced features. But I think anyone using Linux to use Motu hardware is probably doing it as like a last-ditch effort to retain the utility of existing computer, not because they want to use the hardware itself. But that's not the point. The point is, there was a time when I made the decision to use an Apple computer because I had convinced myself that's what I needed to do because I wanted to use really specific hardware. And Steve Jobs probably had something to do with locking in their software ecosystem. But a lot of that also goes back to the earliest days of content creation when studios were still in charge and the industry still wielded all the power. And the only audio interface in all the land was Sonic Solutions, which eventually became Pro Tools. And that was the brainchild of Industrial Light and Magic, of George Lucas's team, because they needed digital audio. They needed to be able to do this stuff for real. And back then, Macintosh was the only platform that had anything that could do that stuff. There's a piece of software. There's a modular software synthesizer, digital modular software synthesizer. God, that's a mouthful. Called Kima, made by a company called Symbolic Sound, and they started off selling DSP-based modular synthesis, and you would spend like $5,000 in '90s money to have, or maybe early 2000s money, late '90s, early 2000s money. You spend $5,000 just to get the most basic version of it. You can spend $20,000 on one of these things in the early 2000s just to have the most powerful synthesizer on earth. And now you can get the most powerful variation of it. I think it's only like $6,000. Maybe it's only like 5. But it's also tiny. It's like the size of a laptop now. And it used to be a full-on like 4-rack unit server case. And it was also Mac only, but now it's cross-platform. I think you're right. This is the end of the middleman. We're seeing the end of the middleman.
Well, what you're reminding me is there's a period in sound manufacturing and audio modulation synthesis in which you had to be rich to be able to do it because there was a hurdle
Oh yeah.
over which you had to get in order to just even be able to experiment with it.
Oh, absolutely.
So unless you had access to like a public synthesizer set or something.
But you had to be in an academic environment to have access to those synthesizers.
Right. Yeah. So it's like unless you had access to a college, you had to be rich to get access to these synthesizer, these analog synthesizers to even start experimenting. So that's where the software synthesizers and digital audio workstations created a level of access that those people are now upset about, and you hear them lamenting that, oh, anybody can make music. It's just so easy. They got Fruity Loops and Reason and all. It's like, yeah, that's the way it always should have been.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that it was prohibitively expensive at one point. The Yamaha DX7, which essentially changed music in the 80s. It's the sound of the 80s, FM synthesis, and they have FM chips in our long gone but formerly adored Creative sound blasters. They use the same chip as would be found in like I think a DX10, and so DX7 just had like double the amount of chips. They made, and those weren't cheap. Those were DX7s were relatively affordable in the grand scheme, but they weren't cheap. And then they made one. The DX, I think it was the DX5, and it was just a bit nicer, but they made a DX1 that was like a $10,000 synthesizer in the 80s. And there aren't that many of them. I've seen pictures of them. They're like consoles. They look like they belong on the bridge of a Star Trek spaceship, of a starship. They are gorgeous, but they're also like, unobtainium. They don't even exist practically. And so there are people who harken back to the days of the original DX7 or the DX7 II, and they want to re-experience those first moments. And you can in software with a piece of software called Dext, which the guy, I think his name's like Daniel something, I could be wrong. The guy who wrote and coded Dext is absolutely a genius because they managed to create a perfect software emulation, like right down to the weird glitchy nature of the circuit topology itself. And I don't care if somebody says, oh, it's not real sounding. It does all of the things, and it's easier to edit than the real thing. Granted, nobody's going to be using it in a live environment, but I don't think very many people are taking their vintage DX7 out to a gig either. They're using like the latest Yamaha that has DX7 patches built into it because they can replace that modern Yamaha synthesizer. They can't replace their vintage Yamaha synthesizer.
Well, they can. So you reminded me of when I first saw a Korg for the first time, where it's like the first Korg I was ever in front of was like a $3,000 synthesizer at the time. Now it's like you can find one used for $400 or $500.
Yeah.
And that's like, you can find a used DX7 for like $400, 200, they're not necessarily cheap for an old synthesizer.
And half the time they don't work. Half the time they have buttons that are
Right.
broken, the sliders crapped
something's
out.
wrong with it.
Some of the keys are dead. They're covered in stickers.
Yeah, like some of these DX7s are up to 1,000, which is like
kind of absurd.
yeah. And that's like
for a 40-year-old
okay.
digital synthesizer.
So there's like software or hardware that like destructive voice modulators, they basically banned making new ones because it was able to destroy the formant frequency in a voice so well that it was able to trick like law enforcement voice tracking technology. So that's where like a VT1 it's probably still,
if you can find
expensive. You can find it, which is where it's like it's not that they banned selling them, it's that the companies aren't allowed to make them anymore. So yeah, it's like it's still $615 for a pre-owned VT1.
I have a VT3 and it does a lot of crazy stuff. But I've heard VT1 before, and it's like a whole different level of robot insanity. Like VT3 is a musical instrument, but VT1 is like
it's not destructive. So it'll modulate your voice.
Yeah.
But if the FBI wanted to like backtrace somebody using a VT3,
they can just demodulate it.
Exactly, because it's only transforming. It's not destructively modulating. Like it's not destroying the formant frequency is what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Which is the change that they made between like the VT1 and the VT3, where it's like I think there are destructive voice modulators that came out later, but they're still prohibitively expensive for modern technology. So it's not going to be.
I have a TC Helicon Voice Live. I have the rack version of it, which is basically the same as their extreme or pro level floorboard unit. And it's a very serious voice synthesizer. It can do harmonies, you can modulate formant and I guess they call it a transducer effect, but really it's a distortion effect. And it has built-in modulation, and you could add spatial artifacts with reverb, and then you can do all sorts of crazy pitch shifty stuff and completely remove the original, the carrier, not the input signal can be removed, and just send like the carrier modified signal out. I can only describe it as a kind of tool that can take your voice to places where it's unusable, and it can also take it to really cool places. But it's prohibitively expensive and it's huge. It's not like the VT3, which you can just toss into a backpack. VT1s are just, I think they're a little bit bulkier, but they actually have a smaller footprint than VT3.
Yeah, I think they're bulkier but smaller footprint, like you're saying, in that they're very heavy duty, and it's actually really difficult to break them. I was amazed, which is also why their resale value is like
they're made of metal.
It keeps going up. I had one in like 2013. I think I got it for like $300, and I sold it like once I didn't need to use it anymore. And I sold it for like $500, I think. So it was like one of the few things that actually appreciates in value because of the specific scenario, which is why the technology that's modern you would think is better, but it's actually not for
well, it's more musical and
Right. Yeah, it's more meant for music than
It's more
actually
musical,
like voice changing.
but yeah, I think that's the dilemma is that with a device like BT1 where it's capable of going to places that are just we don't even understand the context where that could be used in music yet or at the time. I'm sure that somebody could figure it out eventually. But some of the sounds that are capable with that level of synthesis, I mean, there are so many synthesizer sounds that are just like, why is this even a patch? Why was this a preset? And so when you have a tool that just is like free range, like, hey, just whatever you can come up with, any combination of these settings will result in something wildly different from the setting right next to it. Just move this slider a millimeter and dramatically change the output. Like that kind of thing it's like they had very imprecise adjustment available to something that needs surgical adjustment. Like if the sliders had been, instead of like, what are they, like a 80 millimeter, if they'd have been like 240 millimeter, and you could really dial in slowly, I think that would be the way to unlock a tool like that and find that kind of precision. But I also don't think that tool was designed for that kind of use either. I think it was actually supposed to be
Right.
kind of a brute force, obvious, in your face kind of effect.
But then it's like, with that level of granular control, what human ear would actually be able to perceive it? And that's, I
Yeah.
think, ultimately what ends up determining the limits of where these technologies end up going. As far as we can tell, 127 points of motion concerning dynamic range is not like, it's enough that the ear won't be able to perceive that limitation on the range.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, anything beyond that would even really be that perceptible.
Well, the only reason that we have 24-bit and 32-bit floating, and there are some 56-bit hardware and 60-bit hardware solutions out there. But the only reason we have those is for mixing solutions where they have to combine multiple signals and retain as much information as possible. And then they all go through a hardware dithering stage where they're brought back down to a bit depth that is reasonable in terms of the volume of raw data that it's handling, and then the digital audio converters spit that back out, or they just retain it as wave file data, wave information, or whatever raw data the encoders are encoding. Like there are some audio interfaces that have the capability of writing directly to the disk, but they also store it in a unique format that has to be converted back into a wave file. And that's fine if you're in a real-time environment and you have to rely on hardware encoding. But I mean, most recording artists compile things in their nonlinear editing timeline, so it's not quite necessary to have things 100% real-time available. Only a few processes actually have that kind of demand. What's really interesting, though, is the way that I remember at one point when I was younger, effects were really truly in your face. Like VT1 is actually is a perfect example, but there were a lot of the effects, like especially guitar effects, they seem to thrive on like being really obvious. Like, oh yeah, you just stepped on that pedal, I'm on. You can tell. I'm here. I've arrived. And I think it was like right after I got out of high school, it seemed like there was a kind of a push for more transparent effects. Like it was more desirable that these sounds were just barely noticeable. and it was there was like the experimentation phase had ended, and people wanted things to be more about hearing the instrument or the vocalist, and then all these other like the ear candy stuff that's just in the background. It's the icing, it's the sprinkles. But so much of the music that I really enjoy, like so much of the electronic music that I really enjoy, the synthesizers are out front, and the sounds that they're generating, while often completely wild and unusable in a traditional musical context, reach this kind of atonal synergy. And I mean, I can't even describe with words adequately what a group of synthesizers all working together actually sounds like, because it can always be different. But when they get that point when they're all working together and everything is coming together in the moment, it's incredible. And I can't tell what the piano piece behind it would sound like. I have an idea what a drum kit would sound like if some drummer was trying to play that drum part, but I can't tell you what the keyboard line actually looks like. And part of that is really exciting, because I know that a lot of that music isn't made with keyboards. It's made with triggers and buttons, and so the performance doesn't even look like a traditional instrument. And I think that's what appeals to me the most, is that there's the performative act of making the music is very detached from the sound. It doesn't have this kind of Angus Young strutting around the stage, or Mick Jagger walking around like he's in his 20s and acting like he's, well, he is hot shit apparently. But that's what I mean. Is like there's this huge element of like pop music and rock and roll that we know what they're doing because the way they're moving and the way that their performance is leading the eye. But with electronic music, it's like a person standing in front of a keyboard or a platter or a bank of buttons and knobs, and it's all in their hands.
I mean, not necessarily, but even assuming that it.
I mean, I realize that I described a very limited subset of electronic music performance. I know that
right. I mean, like
guys
Twilight Sleep was like 100% live instruments, so it's like there's still electronic music, even if it's played with analog. But I think what we're dancing around is something I personally have tended to come to this conclusion, in that entertainment never should have become transactional, because ultimately the transaction starts to shape the entertainment, whether you like it or not. And that's the reason that something like Patreon is actually more sustainable for continuing to keep a creative output in line with the original intention, rather than something like the transactional YouTube model, or the ad placement on the channel, or the on top of the content,
or the infomercial
or the infomercial. That's not actually sustainable concerning keeping the creative input or the creative output the same, because the transaction starts to determine the pace, the quality, and the frequency of the output. And that's ultimately why, again, we should never have tried to tie experience to transactional exchanges.
Man.
Then like, okay, so I think one of the biggest changes that has occurred is because of the advertising influence on the capacity to like monetize feelings. So for example, Apple, you're not buying the hardware, you're buying the feeling of being elite. And ultimately, there was a period where the hardware was elite in certain situations. But just like Bose, just like Mercedes, just like Audi, they start to exploit the belief in that feeling of elite status and start to cut the quality so that they end up finally getting profitable, because they weren't really profitable when you there's never a profit in quality when it's actual quality. And you find this out when you realize like Bugattis are sold at a loss because it's meant to invoke a certain feeling about, once people realize that Audi is the same technology as the Bugatti, then the loss of investment on the Bugatti name will be attained on the commercial lower quality
Man, better not.
interpretation of
Those
the
Bugatti owners and Audi owners better keep their eyes and ears closed when they're hanging out with the Volkswagen software development teams.
yeah. I mean,
There was one time, actually, Volkswagen tried to release a world-class executive vehicle. It was the Phaeton, and it had all the things. It was like the nicest fucking car, and they only sold them for $80,000 in like 2000s money, and it didn't sell because it was a Volkswagen, even though it was the nicest.
I'm sorry. Volkswagen owns Audi and Bugatti.
Yeah.
It's the Volkswagen. Yeah.
But then what was it? They weren't selling, and it was like the passion project of their CEO, and he really wanted to bring this super high quality, as good as an Audi, but lasts forever with Volkswagen, air quote, Volkswagen quality, or something like that, affordability, and jump ahead a few years later, and that car in its current iteration is the Bentley Continental, and they're selling it for 4 times the amount that the Phaeton ever could have cost, because they actually designed a Bentley instead of a Volkswagen and sold it as a Volkswagen. And nobody bought it.
Volkswagen owns Audi, Bugatti, Bentley, Lamborghini, Porsche, Seat, Skoda, Ducati, MAN, Cupra, obviously Volkswagen, and Volkswagen commercial vehicles. So
Volkswagen's the largest vehicle manufacturer on Earth. They make more vehicles every day all over the globe than anyone else. I think number 2 is Toyota. And then it's GM, something like that. Really, it's crazy when we start looking at like the who's actually holding the umbrella. I mean, really, there's only like five or six car companies, and the rest are just kind of nestled securely under an umbrella. Speaking of the expansion of the auto market, so the Cyber Semi just was finally delivered to Pepsi, and Cybertruck is supposed to happen eventually. And recently, I think it was like the Shanghai Motor Show. There were several Chinese Tesla knockoffs that appeared. Like almost, and there's a company making their version of the Model X, and there's another one making their version of the Model 3, and there's another company making their version of the S. And lo and behold, Tesla itself, which can't even seem to maintain inventory in the United States, has a freaking warehouse full of vehicles that people in China just aren't buying. Because the Chinese can make their version of it for less and still make oodles and oodles of cash. I think a couple of weeks ago, there was one of Elon's other statements was talking about how they make 8 times per vehicle what Toyota makes.
That don't sound right.
That doesn't sound right at all. But we also have to remember that they don't spend any money on marketing. they're spending. I mean, they get free advertising from their acolytes, and so they just don't need to spend that money on it, I guess. Also, Model S costs like $100,000. Model X is like a $89,000 vehicle. A Model 3 is like a $40-something thousand car. It was supposed to be like a $30,000 car, but that didn't happen.
I thought that was the whole point, was bringing down the price, the entry point. And it's like, yeah, that didn't really happen.
Well, then they made the Model Y, which is like the same market and price range as a Model 3. I'm pretty sure that GM's going to nail it. They're going to knock it out of the park when they deliver their sub $30,000 Equinox. That was their big announcement, along with the release of their latest model of skateboard platform.
Well, and I get a feeling that the Hyundai Ioniq will get figured out in their second round. Like, yeah. I'm not sure if they get it right on the first round, but I think they get it right on the second round.
Oh, I mean, Kia nailed it with EV6. That vehicle is fantastic. That's what I read is that it did so well, it eclipses the performance of the Kia Stinger, and that's the reason that the Stinger program was, closed. They made a world-class GT car, and it was their lowest volume selling vehicle. And then, like 2 years later, they release EV6, or 3 years later, they release EV6, and it's just outperforms their world-class GT car.
So I saw an electric Mustang yesterday, and it looks exactly like the EV6, and that sucks.
Oh,
those two cars. I mean, I don't know if you've seen it. It's like the idea that Tesla should be the electric vehicle leading the design for how all the other car shapes is like a disaster for actual like car design, because now everything is trying to look like a Tesla that's not a Tesla, and then it ends up just looking like each other, which is then it looks nothing like a Mustang.
I saw a Mustang. It was bright yellow. The E Mustang or whatever. It reminds me of a Mustang.
The Mach-E.
The Mach-E, yeah. It looked like it looked like it ate a small car. Like if cars were some kind of giant fauna, it looked like it ate a compact car and was just bloated. It didn't look like a Mustang to me.
Yeah, that's like a good way to describe it.
It was like if it was the love child of a Mustang and an Escape, and it had just eaten, and it was bloated and was going home to pass out. It ate two compact cars. That's what it looked like to me. It did not look like a sports car, or it didn't look like it belonged in the Mustang family even. It looked like an Escape, but stretched out. And
it wouldn't. I don't think it would be so bad if they didn't call it a Mustang, but the idea that they're gonna redesign the Mustang like this and then make it electric at the same time was just terrible. Like, shoot yourself in the foot type shit, where it's like they should have just had a different name for that vehicle and then kept the Mustang design if they're gonna make it electric, and then change the design in a different year, because otherwise, no Mustang that I've ever remembered. In similar fashion,
with what they did with the Camaro way back in the day to compete with Mustang, GM is gonna, what do they call it when they spin off? Yeah, they're gonna spin off Corvette into its own brand. And Corvette Level 1 is the Corvette we all know and appreciate, and they're going to electrify it. and they're going to make a 4-door fastback level 2 and call it Corvette. A Corvette with 4 doors. And then they're going to make a level 3, which is a SUV with lift or with ground clearance and even more trunk for junk. They're going to call that Corvette also. It's a Corvette SUV. Like that, I get it. People want to drive a Porsche SUV because they need more space, and they still want to drive a Porsche, but really they're driving a Volkswagen. And people want to do the same thing in their Lamborghini, and really it's a Volkswagen. and so yeah, people want to drive a Corvette, but they really need to be able to take their kids to soccer, and then to karate, and then to their physical trainer, and then they take them to study group, and they got to do it all with like blazing speed. I get that. Why can't they just call it something else? Have we run out of names for cars? Is that really where we're at? We've run out of ways to name vehicles.
They were just using animals anyway, right?
So we've run out of animals that people can recognize. I mean, what's Camaro? It's not an animal. That's just a mythical creature that eats Mustangs.
It was derived from the word comrade.
Wait,
the term also was meant to be a small, vicious animal that eats Mustangs. Yeah.
So it's like simultaneously communist and libertarian.
Yeah. That's funny.
But at least they're not spinning off Camaro into its own brand and giving it 4 doors or an SUV treatment.
But are they going to do an electric Camaro?
Oh man, that'll just be like, I think that's the actual end of the Chevy muscle car if they make an electric Camaro. I mean, not that the muscle car era needs to extend any further. All of those giant engine Dodges are insane. Just
Their next model is a high performance electric sedan.
sedan.
Oh God, it's closer to the recent Camaro than the electric Mustang is to the.
But it's got 4 doors.
Yeah.
Okay, so that means that Camaro finally accepted reality, gave up on the dream, and knows that the smart decision is to drop the kids off at school and go to work. Camaro is no longer a mullet wearing single lens sunglasses, tank top if you're lucky, like, hooting and hollering personality. They're wearing a suit.
Mm-hmm.
Man, who'd have thought that electricity would be the thing that signaled the end of vehicles like that? I mean, I guess it was always going to happen, because once the hypercars happened, like the Koenigsegg's and Bugattis and the Paganis and the Gumperts and all that stuff. Once the Gundam cars started to emerge, there really wasn't any place for a muscle car anymore. Like what's a car that can only go in a straight line going to do against a car that can go really fast in a straight line and around the corners? Nothing. Just watch it get smaller as it drifts away. Racing minivans and trucks in a straight line. That doesn't sound like fun either. There are just too many cars on the road for that kind of vehicle to exist.
Yeah, I think we're definitely hitting a proverbial brick wall with car development. Uh, like all this horsepower with
No point.
nowhere to go,
Yeah.
increasing traffic.
Well, if we can't go fast, we'll just burn more fuel. I was watching this breakdown about the costs of starting an engine, like modern cars that are designed with start-stop systems versus like an older style of you don't run your starter all the time because it'll wear it out. And so a modern start-stop system, like the kind you see on hybrids and modern direct injection vehicles, they use so little fuel to start and stop that the only real concern is how much wear does it put onto the actual engine components itself, because the starter is now it's robust and it's no longer a weak point in the system. And like a study was concluded that the average driver believes that they can idle for up to 3 minutes before they incur some kind of fuel consumption penalty. But it turns out that really it's more like 30 seconds, and then you start to incur a idle penalty in terms of fuel consumption. And there's always the concern of how much additional wear is happening down the line. Like there's always some kind of additional wear of starting something up. It's gonna wear out the rings, or it's gonna do something else. That's not the point. The point, though, is that modern cars use so little fuel just sitting there because they can turn on and off really easily, and that's one of the new areas where they're fighting for that tiny tenth of or hundredth of percent of fuel economy improvement. And engines are getting smaller because smaller engines can sip fuel. Like the bigger the engine gets, the more fuel it uses at idle, the more fuel it uses to start even. And so, of course, there are some places like big trucks, which are going to be replaced by electric vehicles at some point once the battery problem is solved and the energy generation issue is resolved. That's going to happen. And then it'll just be an issue of recharge times being the big concern. But until that happens, I think you're right. I don't think we're going to be seeing people fighting for the fastest so much as they're going to be fighting for the most efficient. Like the last gas-powered vehicle standing will be the absolute most efficient version of what we grew up with. And then the last hybrids, those will probably just exist as range extenders for people that demand to be able to drive themselves, 1,000 miles in one sitting.
Well, it's not just in the auto industry, but one of the problems with competition being the basis for the market, and then a monopoly and monopsony simultaneously developing, is that then the only competition becomes last year's version of that organization. So it's like there's like a commercial out. Walmart is now basically competing with its own prices from last year, and they understand that that's like the impediment they have to overcome in order to sell the people that they already have as customers on spending more than they already spend. And it's like ultimately the combination of like inflation, but also the notion that infinite growth is part of their system demand. It's become like they absorbed all their competitors, so now that's like all that's left to compete is basically they're fighting entropy in real time.
There's still
because
one.
There's no.
So this year, I noticed that there's a new laptop or brand, a computer brand on the market, EVOO, or EVOO. It's a Chinese company, but it's also the house brand for Walmart. And they are selling computers with chips, chipsets, RAM, GPUs, screens. Everything is 100% competitive with the big three, with Lenovo, Dell, and HP on spec, but on price, they are better than the big three for the same hardware. That's the power of Walmart. They can just jump into the gaming computer laptop microcosm and sell something competitive for less than the big three. They're a behemoth. They're not even trying to compete on like the server market or the business market. They're just selling gaming computers and mainstream computers. And they're undercutting the competition. Of course, there's no like expectation of quality because they just appeared and they don't have, decades of providing customers with, personal heaters and fire starters, but that's probably a good thing.
But they also get like $250 million in subsidies.
Yeah.
Every year. $569 subsidies for a total of $245 million.
Whoa.
So yeah, they're a behemoth. If the government gave me $245 million to operate a company, I'd be able to do some shit with that too.
Man,
I mean, tax breaks. It's not they're getting cash, but they're getting tax breaks all across.
Yeah,
different Walmarts.
An extra $245 million in their budget every year is pretty nice. Yeah.
Well, I think this just goes up to 2017. So.
Oh, so they might be getting like 300 million, 400 million now.
Well, okay, hold up. This is like, I think this is total subsidies. It's hard to say. It's at least $245 million worth of subsidies that Walmart has gotten, whether it's like yearly, because it feels like it's broken down by the individual organization, but then they break it down by year for that organization. So there's like a cumulative subsidy amount, but then it's like broken down. So I think this is saying since like 1992, they've received, okay, this is the total federal awards from 2000 to the present.
Okay.
Not per year.
Okay, still. That's still.
Yeah, it's way different than $245 million a year, but still that's
still $10 million a year.
Yeah. Yeah. Which on average of 10 million in subsidies per year is like, yeah, then they should be an institution like that. But then in the process, they've outsourced a lot of their outsourced the products that they put on their shelves. So in the process of the government subsidizing this organization, they have created a venue in which, or helped to create a venue in which subsidies are going to make American production less valuable because there's a cheaper alternative that can be exploited because of government oversight or the inability for government to enforce quality of life so that these people are being exploited. And then this is also why Apple Apple's moving to India or looking to move to India from China, because as Chinese government is more able to enforce standards that improve the quality of life for the workers, then organizations that were there for exploitation start to move. It's not like they start following the rules. They just go somewhere else where they can find another gap. So this EVU will eventually be coming out of India, because ultimately this gap between American consumers not caring how their products are made and Chinese government not being able to enforce the underpaid, overworked product, like regional outputs, because it happens in multiple industries, whether it's like shoes or clothing or technology that's in the form of smartphones or computers or whatever. They do it within a window of operation that allows them to make money legally internationally, because the international authorities are not concerned with local compliance with regulation. And that's ultimately how Nike was able to have like slave labor conditions anywhere, or Apple and Foxconn able to have slave labor conditions where people are living in dormitories on campus that basically are, I mean, it's not basically, they are definitely indentured servants at the best, straight up slaves at the worst. And they don't really have lives outside of this work environment. And ultimately, when people are put in situations where that's their only real option, it's like manufacturer compliance. But the other option in many cases is homelessness or death by negligence by society. But it's not as if these are the only outcomes, but it's framed as if these are the only outcomes if people don't follow capitalism's exploitation.
What's rough is that China has a very complex and thorough system of what's the word? They call them qualification exams, but it's really like a broad aptitude test that they conduct regularly. And so people who have aptitude and score high end up going to a college or a university. And if they're in like the top third or top 3% academically, then they might get to study engineering or science. If they're in the top percentile, they're definitely going to be a scientist or an engineer. And people that score low, opportunities start disappearing pretty quickly. Like as children, like they identify which kids have music aptitude very early, and they get to study music. And then the people who are mathematically inclined, they really push math. Language skills, you get to study language. It's not like it is here, where the doors of opportunity, or at least the illusion of opportunity, still exists, like after primary school even. I mean, here once you get out of high school, you can go to college or you can get a job, and there's a whole trade school network of they're not quite colleges, but they're definitely more than, I guess they're trade schools. And people can go and find a job, they get a loan, go to school, hopefully they can get a job in that industry. But in China, it's all about your examinations.
Well, and in that context, from what I've
It still doesn't mean that those
gleaned,
people deserve to be treated less than normal people. They should absolutely be
no, I
provided human
mean
rights.
that. Well, from what I've gleaned, those are meant to be what they are in theory, but then
It doesn't
because of
actually
the way
work.
those exams work, everybody who gets to the highest level has to cheat in order to do that because the exams are so prohibitively hard that in order to place in the top 3%, it's like the same thing with sports now where you have to actually do performance enhancing drugs just to get into that top percentage
Yeah.
because other people are doing it.
Oh, and
it
then there's
makes it
rampant
like,
bribery because
right, that's part in
there's
it. And so
huge
it
high level
becomes
of
like
corruption in academia in China. Like,
it actually ends up showing who's better at that than the meritocracy that it was intended to be. So there's
yeah,
definitely obviously people who are good at those things who get recognized by the system, but the system itself has then become its own uh, institutional hurdle that it was meant to overcome. But in the other context, this false sense of meritocracy in the American context is the hurdle, which is then it's like the more people understand that um, somebody who is poor doesn't have the same opportunity as somebody who's wealthy, just even if they're like, say they're competing for the same job. Well, the poor person has to make sure that they don't or let's say type of job, so it's like not one application. The rich person or the wealthy person is going to have more time to do more application. So out the gate, it's going to be more likely that they're going to have more exposure and opportunity to get access to these jobs than somebody who has to worry about paying their bills in real time to then have luxury time to be concerned about improving their socioeconomic status through getting a better job. And so the notion that people can like work their way up, like working a person's way up is a luxury. If you don't have free time to actually devote to the process of moving up or lose sleep or lose time somewhere else in your schedule, that person doesn't actually have time to be socially mobile. So social mobility existing as an opportunity does not actually mean it's attainable for everyone, but the perception that it's attainable then I think is the like counterpart to that appearance of meritocracy in the national exam context. Because I mean, just think about the notion of like hard work is meant to pay off, but that's not a guarantee. There's no actual correlation of hard work equaling success. That's what the entire premise of the market was meant to be. And when that is thrown off because there's a nepotistic aspect dictating success, then that ruins. I mean, we've talked about it before, but then value is completely thrown off. So the things that are actually useful do not equal value to the people that need those widgets or services or protocols or whatever. But because they don't understand why they would need those things, it becomes impossible for them to place their capital in ways that benefit them because they're constantly on guard for being exploited. So it's like I see shit like cryptocurrency, and then people try to get into it and pretend it's like, oh, I'm in it for the technology. It's like, no, just say you're in it for money. That's fine, because once we get that out of the way, then we can figure out like why you should get out of it and why you should go do something else that's actually going to help you make money better than getting into something that you have no fucking idea about at all because other people seem to be making money getting into something they know nothing about at all.
Man, like, I'm not gonna lie, the money from crypto is nice. The hardware stuff was really fun for like 20 minutes, and I love computers. I love computers. I enjoy configuring them. I enjoy assembling. I enjoy building networks. The whole shebang. I think it's one of the most fun things to do. I am a nerd. I accept this. Building a mine and maintaining a mine for months is a full-time job. Like doing it right.
Yep. And it's not fun.
It's not fun. It's systems administration. And unlike a systems administration job with like some corporation that actually has need for giant server systems, that's a steady rate of income. With mining, man, you're like at the mercy of the electrical grid. You're at the mercy of the network difficulty. You're at the mercy of trading. You're at the mercy of validators. Like the whole thing is just, it's so tangled.
Well, and then 90% of the time is just monitoring that nothing is wrong. And the other 10% is trying to figure out what the fuck is preventing your shit from working and not understanding why nothing is working.
And 100% of your downtime is replacing hardware.
Yeah. And so there's not a lot of actual time where you can spend enjoying mining in a way that is presented from the people who want to sell mining shares. And I was always skeptical of the notion of selling mining shares in the sense of like, if they're valuable, why would you sell them and not just keep them? So it like never really made sense to me that anybody who was mining would like sell their hardware's output as if keeping output wasn't more profitable, because then it's like, hold on, that's a red flag.
Wait, isn't that like shorting the crypto token?
Yes.
That's shorting the token.
Yes. So because they're paying for electricity to accumulate that, and then they're immediately offloading. So yes, they are. So it, in a way, because miners had an electricity cost that then forced them to short the token constantly, or the coin, with whatever you want to, at any point we could be talking about stuff that's not Bitcoin, but the behavior of mining demanded that they pay for electricity, which then, like, again, in the grand scheme, they're borrowing electricity to accumulate tokens or coins that they end up having to pay the electricity for, which in effect is shorting the coin, because they have to sell that coin to then pay for the electricity. So it was always a behavioral mercenary situation that people were not willing to acknowledge was, and they were trying to say, "Oh, I'm in it for the tech. I just, I want to be on the cutting edge. I want to mine for myself." No, you want to make money. That's okay. It's okay. But masking it behind that internally inconsistent notion of mining for the tech, well, you're actually shorting the tech when you mine and offset. Like, if people mined and didn't sell and were only then paying for the electricity cost and just sitting on it, that's different. But that's not what was happening. That's not what was happening in almost any situation, because ultimately, the hardware costs and the electricity costs, and in many cases the space costs and the cooling costs, were too much for them to just keep accumulating and waiting for an exit point that wasn't too close to one of their bills coming due.
Like even NiceHash, they would let you mine whatever they had available, whatever script was out there, but then they pay you out in Bitcoin.
Which means that they would have to sell the other token.
So they were shorting the tokens They were
Yeah.
just shifting the transaction point from the miner to the the foreman.
And in the process, make automatically ensuring that those tokens would be sold immediately once they were mined, instead of being saved. Which, when you're mining through NiceHash, it feels like you're mining Bitcoin and saving it just from the way that their interface works, but you're mining something else, selling that something else, and then receiving Bitcoin for the automated exchange for that something else. And I've known many people who then they use my NiceHash. It's like, because of the way that it works, the interface, they think they're just like straight up mining Bitcoin.
No,
So
you're
I'm not.
Yeah, once you open up their little control utility, you can see exactly what you're mining.
Right, but I'm not surprised that people get confused, because it's actually not. It's not difficult, but the way that you have to like know what you're doing to get to that screen.
They don't make it easy.
It's like it's not easy. So it's almost as if it's.
Well, NiceHash makes it simple. They simplify the whole process. You just install their software and turn it on, and it starts churning away, and that's actually really nice, because it takes a lot of the extensive research that one would have to go through to set up miners to mine any of the multitude of tokens that they had available at any given point. But even then, like, I remember putting in time and researching what Equihash was, and Zcash and Monero and all of the coins and tokens that they had available, and it still didn't. At the end of it all, it didn't influence my decision to mine any of the coins. I was just mining whatever had the best return at that given moment. And when I would talk to people during this last wave of Ethereum, Doge, Shiba Inu madness before the last cold spell, most people that I talked to didn't care about the technology. It was just gambling. There were the only people that I remember asking about mining. It seemed more like a curiosity, less about the actual practicality of doing it. I mean, I think it's the same thing when people think that they can grow weed, and they don't realize that it has to be tended to and cultivated. Like a mine has to be maintained and monitored, and it's like a daily thing. Sometimes twice a day there's an update. 3 times a day sometimes there's an update where you have to take your machines offline one by one and update them, because until they're updated, they're not doing anything. And I mean, I'm pretty good at managing multiple machines, but you know, once you're doing the same operation on like 7 computers, and it's noisy and hot, and the fans are blowing everything around you, like that's a recipe for, you know, tiny errors. Especially when there's like this kind of self-imposed and artificial urgency of like, oh, I got to get this done. The mine's not churning away. I'm losing time. Oh no, someone else is gonna get my token. Fuck. And of course, it doesn't happen like a slot machine. It's not like instantaneous. It takes hours, days, weeks. And I don't even know what mining is like now. I can only imagine that it's even worse, like not even worth it.
It's like negative for everything, which is where your daily income, if you were to mine on NiceHash with an RTX 3070, -3 cents a day.
Oh, but if you hold on to those tokens, eventually they'll be worth something maybe someday.
Supposedly.
If the economy ever restores
RTX
itself.
3090, negative 5 cents a day.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So that performance improvement costs 2 extra cents to run.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I've watched them. Yeah, RTX 3090 negative 10 cents a day. At one point, like it would go up to maybe $70 a day. For like what is it? I had like 5 devices running at that point. And I think the highest profitability I hit was like $120 a day. Um, during like when Bitcoin was at like 60 grand.
Yeah.
So there were times where I was like, this can't last forever.
Nope.
And when it lasts for a few days in a row, you start getting delusional and thinking like, what if this does last forever? Where you're like, I just made $100 today. Just like my computers were, cost maybe $2 or some shit to run that day. And then it net me $100 profit. Or maybe even more than that, maybe 120. And when that happens, it's like a very delusional moment. Because first off, that day I was getting more shares returned than normal. So it was like, yeah, my miners were like doing exceptionally well that day. But obviously Bitcoin wasn't going to stay at that level forever. Or Ethereum wasn't going to stay at that level forever, and GPU mining wasn't going to be around forever. So it's obvious that shit is not going to last forever. But when it's happening, it's like really easy to get wrapped up in it, especially if you're not that person. Seeing somebody be like, "Oh, I made $120 today," then you're like, "Fuck, what am I doing? How am I missing out on this shit?" And then other people start to chase that. And it's like I see how it happens where because it's not luck when I'm in that period making that much, because I've been in the periods where I wasn't making anything and gone through and sold mining hardware and then reacquired mining hardware. So it's like it's not just this linear like, oh, you buy mining hardware and then you make money and then the market dies and then you sell your mining hardware. It's like knowing when to enter the market as a miner is like very difficult, even if it's possible. But like now, for example, it would be a risk because like if somebody was to buy ASIC mining hardware, it would be a huge risk because it might never come back the way it was, but it could also pay off if somebody put a bunch of money into ASIC miners and then the price shot back up and then suddenly ASIC miners are super expensive again. And it's like, you just never know which play is going to work out, but the risk, the capacity to take those risks ends up looking like someone knowing what they're doing more than just actually being able to take risks.
Yeah, but somebody buying ASIC miners is essentially engaging in commodities trading of the crypto universe. That's way more. That's a way deeper level of involvement than somebody who's just gonna, install nice hash. I'm in fact, I haven't read very much about ASIC hardware. Like in the early 10 years ago, when ASIC miners first started to emerge, like the Antminer stuff. I remember reading about those devices all the time. And then in this last big wave, it was just GPUs because we couldn't find GPUs for anything. You could get a used GPU that somebody had mined the crap out of, and then you could play games on it for a while, but it was probably going to die. But it was all GPUs. In fact, in this last wave of crypto mining, I remember seeing more mining-centric motherboards with 20 PCIe times one speed slots, and some of them had like 20, or some would have like a bank of 20 USB 3 slot sockets, so they could run GPUs off of that. And these computers are pretty insane because they can't be used like a normal computer. You have to have a big open chassis so that you can have all of your intermediate connectors going from board to GPU. But you can't use those things for like gaming. I suppose you could use it in like a development environment if you were running like modeling software, like geological modeling software, physical modeling software. That would make sense. But I've never seen computers in like geological modeling environments that looked like open chassis crypto mining computers. They're almost always purpose-built Unix boxes that are running software that nobody knows about, often coded by the scientists themselves. I think the smartest thing that I've read about this last post-mining downturn is that quite a few, like not necessarily data centers, but cloud processing companies have emerged. They're just leasing server time because they've got powerful servers now.
Well, and that was like what GPU farms were moving towards anyway.
Yeah.
Like Pixar and shit. I think they were already using
Yeah, render farm.
render farm. So that was that was going to happen with or without crypto.
Yeah.
I think crypto likes to take credit for it, but or make it seem like somehow they're going to make it more democratic, but not really. In many ways, it's like over engineering shit that they already figured out how to do without a cryptocurrency involved or without a blockchain involved.
Yeah, Paul Krugman just wrote an article. It's like, what is a blockchain? Like, what do we actually need it for? And he expanded upon essentially what you just said. And he goes into how there's a broader economic impact. There's an agricultural impact. Our electrical grid has suffered. There's a broader economic impact in the way that it has essentially siphoned money out of the economy. People have taken money that they probably would have spent on food or housing or healthcare or their vehicle, and then they shoved it.
I don't know about that. Those people would have put it in lottery tickets. Period.
Yeah, probably.
I don't like. I'm not a real fan of Paul Krugman in that I think a lot of his theories are made from an ivory tower, especially like that one.
Yeah.
And it's like it's not wrong.
Well, I think he's talking about a small portion
how he gets
of
there, I think, is like
his ideas reflect a very small portion of the population involved in crypto.
Right, but even then, crypto isn't inherently like consuming electricity. Like the only type is proof of work that consumes electricity at that scale. So
what we've had for the most part.
No, it's what people have been aware of for the most part. Like if anything, most of them have been proof of stake because proof of stake are easier to deploy. In many ways, because you have to have a proof of work network of miners to make your token resistant to attack, which is a lot easier to do with proof of stake, to then do airdrops rather than trying to like get people invested in your token by having them mine without being able to get like airdropped. And that's like the early stages of faucets and proof of stake validation and things like that were like the Bitcoin maximalists and the proof of work maximalists would make it seem like they weren't existing when like BitShares was around in 2014, and then that became EOS, which at one point was like in the top 5 cryptocurrencies.
Didn't EOS also turn out to be a scam? Or the guy was just a grifter?
The guy who he wasn't the one that invented it. He was just the rich person that tried to hijack the technology to then become the face of it. And yeah, he's like basically a colonist and colonizer in what's it called in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I was gonna say like he popped up in Puerto Rico after
Brock, what's his name? Hager, sorry.
Yeah,
Mark Pierce.
I remember he appeared like giving a bunch of talks about EOS in Puerto Rico right after that was the hurricane like 4 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever it was, 5 years ago. The one that flooded the place and just destroyed it the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember there were a bunch of like he had a bunch of like broadcasts of talking about EOS, and it just didn't. There was something really unsettling about it. Whereas like listening to Vitalik talk about Ethereum, he would talk about really high concept things. The EOS guy just made me feel like I was being sold a timeshare.
Right. I mean,
there's so many things about cryptocurrency that just set off red flags for me. And like now it just seems like it's it seems like people want it to be the Wild West again, but it can't be.
Well, here's the thing. The timeshare only became a scam because Americans didn't have time to use them. So the timeshare isn't actually a scam unless you buy it without actually having time to use it. Then it's a scam in the same way that gym memberships aren't scams. They're only scams in the notion that there's the understanding that most Americans who buy them aren't going to use them. So that's why it has the appearance of a scam, but it's only because Americans are willing to buy things with the intention of using them without ever actually having any intention of using them. So in that case, like
that's like anti-sunk cost.
Backyard. Well, yeah, but in that case, like backyard pools are a scam. Fucking insurance is a scam. Like there's a lot of things that are scams if we understand that the premise of you might use this one day is like a way to get capital. So that part is always a scam, but it's like it's only a scam if you don't use it. Insurance always feels like a scam until you need it, until you use it. And it's like, oh shit, I actually needed that. And then it's like my parents are one of their friends owns timeshares and they use that shit every month because they're retired and they don't have shit to do. So they're like constantly on vacation where I'm like, yeah, I bet a bunch of people have timeshares and they don't use them. So then it is a scam. Where again, it's like, it's only a scam insofar as how much something gets paid for without being ever actually capable of being used, or the intention of the person selling that thing intending the user to actually take utility of that thing.
I think it was the promise that eventually it would be worth a lot more. That's the part that made me feel like it was the timeshare scam factor. It's like, oh yeah, just once you're in, just we're gonna grow the economy until we're all rich. And you've mentioned this before. You can't just create money from nothing. And the people who actually make out big on this stuff, they go in with money. I think most of the people that I know that bought like Shiba or Doge or Ethereum this last time around, I think most of them we're lucky to break even. But I think you're right. I think it's the whole like.
But it's the same with poker players.
That's true. You got to know when to
Poker
call
players
it.
over time tend to break even. They aren't generally. They're either net negative or zero sum, and it's like they just don't talk about it. You know, I had a friend who was a professional poker player in like 2003, 2004.
Oh, the online stuff was big.
No, it wasn't even online. It was like in person games.
Oh, that's even cooler.
So it was like this person, like he had enough money built up to take risks in poker. But because I'd known him before he got into it, he was honest with me about it. And he was like, yeah, it's mostly break even, where it's like when you talk to people in it, it's like they tend, because you can't win all the time, the odds of the win being a big hand versus the loss being a bigger hand than the win tend to be higher towards the loss. So it's just the reality of probability means that you have to be really consistently logical to overcome probability. And that's one of the most difficult aspects of the gambling is consistently knowing when to play logically, and over psychological tests show that like the more a person gets down, the harder it is to stay logical.
Yeah. Well, like we treated it like I mean, obviously there's an initial investment in hardware, and that's a dollar amount, and then there's the running cost of electricity and all the other supporting hardware. And so the way that we operated was we mined the tokens, and then once we would get to a certain point, we would shave it off, and eventually we would brought the total cost of the initial investment was recuperated. We had reached our ROI, and then at that point, we would just let the machines run and replace hardware as necessary and pay electricity, and then essentially just when it was paid out, we would make the transfer. And so once ROI was reached, it seems like all profit. But we weren't actively sitting on coins and waiting for them for the rise and fall. It was just, this is what they're worth at this moment in the market, and we will move it into Bitcoin. And then when that reaches a certain number, pull it out of Bitcoin. I think there was a few attempts at arbitrage, but I wasn't versed enough in that to make it work for me.
Well, and that's where again arbitrage.
That's where the money is.
Do it with anything. I mean, it's not though. It's zero sum too. Eventually, people get stuck with inventory that they can't move. And all of their positive moves end up getting lost on one big move that they thought they were going to make and do it again. And it's like, this is how game theory plays out over time in ways that the gambler's delusion makes it seem like, okay, every instance resets the probability, even though a person's experience, like every time you get in the car, it's the same probability that you're going to get in an accident, but it would feel like every time you get in the car, the probability goes up since your last accident, or it goes down if you just got an accident. But in reality, it's the same every single time you get, and it's the same with like a plane crash.
Yeah.
So the gambler's fallacy is really hard to know when to reset the round. And I think that's ultimately, like with every game, the number resets technically, but in reality, the number of cards being dealt may change depending on if they're physical cards or if they're digital, being represented by number generators. So it's like in certain cases, if you're playing at a live table with one deck of cards, then your odds change. Like they reset after every hand, but it's not back to zero because the order of cards has been changed in a way that continues to have a force impacting it. Whereas if it was like a digital card game where every new deck was reset back to complete zero, then that does completely remove the notion of, oh, what happened in the previous hand? Well, that doesn't actually matter.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
think that's
really difficult to know which situation you're in.
That was kind of the reason.
Because of our continuous existence.
Well, that was kind of the reason that we did not get back into mining, is because all the signs did not point to proceed. There were enough barriers that said, maybe not. Also, it's a full-time job, and not nearly as exciting as one could talk themselves into believing.
Well, and then it's like, yeah, it feels like a profit, but after all the amount of time that you put into doing it, it's like if you would have put that amount of time into something else, like one thing, you could have potentially made the same amount of money.
Yeah.
Ultimately. And that's why it feels like it's a net positive in many cases, because it's like, oh, well, at least I'm not like lifting a bunch of computers or whatever, working at an actual Best Buy or something where I'm doing physical labor, but you're still doing mental labor. In some cases, you are doing physical labor. So it doesn't even end up being like some sort of retirement where you're like, oh, I just started I turn on my miners and now profit, passive income. All this income's passive.
Oh man!
Like, no, there's actually a lot of action.
I got a really big kick out of the mining appliances that were being marketed for a very short time. They're like the size of a PlayStation, and said you can mine Bitcoin at home with just this thing the size of a PlayStation. Barely uses electricity. 90 watts. 90 watts. Yeah, I had an entire basement dedicated to computers. She was loud and hot. Your mining rig can get loud and hot too.
Well, and that's another thing where even in trying to anticipate enough space so that the miners didn't overheat, it was like the experiment we did, it was like we underestimated the heat buildup, and it was like after maybe like 8 or 10 hours, there would be so much heat buildup that the temperature in the room would cause the hardware to overheat. So it's like,
oh, we get heat soak.
Tests, right, and it would be, you know, depending on I'd try to adjust the airflow in the room, and it's like sometimes it would be days, but eventually it would build up and overheat. And that was like trying to do it without adding additional cooling to the room, which then increases the cost. So it's like you get to these points where you think you can do it one way, but then you're like, oh, actually physics demands that you can't keep doing it this way, or your hardware is going to overheat and go out.
I was running an air conditioner in the winter, keeping my mind cool enough to not, set off any alarms. And all of the alarms that I'd set were really conservative. Like, if it just starts to get close to a certain temperature range, let me know, type stuff. And It's that's one of those things that we really we really I really took for granted how much heat a computer really puts off, because every like co-location facility I've ever seen, the cooling solution they have is so profound that you just kind of take it for granted. And like big data centers, you can't even talk in those places. They're so loud. And so for a mine to not have an adequate cooling solution, that's just like, that's one of those things that doesn't exist in dialogues on forums. What are you guys using for your cooling solution? And it reminds me like pictures of the Chinese ASIC mines where it looks like a giant warehouse with no walls, and the machines themselves are like a foot or two away from each other minimum, and then there are fans everywhere, and it's just as loud as a data center, except there are no walls and they're just in the mountains somewhere. Like the idea of running computers in open air to me just seems like, what the really? But
Well, it was a lot of those that ended up getting flooded.
yeah,
Because it's like, yeah, they flock to those regions because of the cheap or free electricity costs
and the
and
and the
the
idealized
process.
temperature,
Yeah,
but
but it was because they were in valleys.
yeah, yeah, nice cold floodable valleys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would see that stuff and I would things like, there's who can compete with that except another state entity.
Well, and then a lot of those machines were then they were trying to ship them to Texas, and it was destabilizing the Texas power grid. So they had to end up like, and they were trying the Bitcoin people were trying to justify like the instability as if it was benefiting the locals for some people to not have power during a winter, because they were making some other people were making money. Um,
So this is how it ends, right? Like, got miners eating up all the juice and electric cars eating up all the juice, and nobody can keep their heat on in winter, and the grid fails because everyone's charging their cars and running their mines at the same time.
oh yeah, so they're following up on that, and there's like uh, Elizabeth Warren's doing a probe of Bitcoin's impact on the Texas power grid.
Oh boy.
Um, then I guess they limited miners' electricity during the summer because of what had happened during the winter. um,
So that means that ERCOT, the Texas power grid, which is segregated from the eastern and western power grids and then the extensions into Canada, that means that ERCOT doesn't even have enough juice to fill the pipes. They're
no,
they're
that's
not
what it sounds
they're
like.
unable to produce enough electricity. They can barely meet the demands of I want to keep my house running and run the air conditioner in Texas, which is pretty much mandatory in Texas. It places gets hot, but they can barely satisfy that. How the hell are they going to make enough juice to power up all the electric trucks and run all the mines? It just doesn't seem like it can work. Not if the energy is all derived from natural gas or coal. Because, once again, we can't mine that stuff fast enough.
Yeah, I don't think that the current infrastructure, the way it's built on uh, renewables, will work for electrical infrastructure. Um, Maybe electric vehicles will be something that we use between cities, but the cities are going to have to be more public transportation for this to work.
I mean,
but also people don't need a fucking car. Like if the public transportation is available and the cities are built well, people don't actually need cars. So the idea that we should continue to need this same level of vehicle on the road for like one car per person, or maybe even 2 cars per person on this trajectory it's obviously not sustainable, but it's not really logical either.
I agree, and I would like to point out that we are also in the 2 car per person class.
There were a total of 275 million vehicles registered in 2020 in the United States.
And they make like hundreds of thousands of vehicles every year. And they're not disposing of hundreds of thousands of vehicles every year. That's not happening. No wonder there's not enough gas.
Almost a car per person for every human in America.
I mean, that tracks. I mean, there's a gun for every human in America.
Well, but then how many of are actually of driving age? Because that's where it's yeah. There's more cars than there are people of way more cars than there are people of driving age.
You know what's funny is that occasionally I read about some like 5-year-old taking a car for a joyride. Occasionally, it's like maybe once a year or once every 2 years. But more often than not, I read about some kid that gets a hold of a firearm and actually discharges it. I'm not sure that I'm not sure I'm worried as much about kids with cars.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.